persuaded me to do it. We're going to discuss today the works of James Boswell, a rather remarkable biographer and writer in his own right. Boswell lived from 1740 to 1795, only 55 years, and the relative brevity of his life partially explains why we have so little from him during his lifetime and so much from him after his lifetime. There's an anomaly here, and I'm going to explain it in just a few moments. Boswell was born in Edinburgh in 1740. His father was a judge in the Court of Sessions at Edinburgh, and he was educated at home. He was homeschooled from 1740 to 1748. And then for the next 10 years, he went to the University of Edinburgh. You mean he started the university at the age of 8? Well, he graduated from the university in 58. And actually, people were admitted to colleges at the age of 12, so he was in prior tutoring. 1759, he attended the University of Glasgow with lectures by Adam Smith. Adam Smith, of course, wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which I've told you is a major economic work. And we've already mentioned how Adam Smith sets the priorities of a nation. But Adam Smith is a major Scottish philosopher. And if you're going to study philosophy during this period, you really go to the Scots to see what they have to say. From 1762 to 63, he wrote the London Journal, in which he explains a number of his experiences. That is, it covers those years. But on May 16, 1763, when he was 23 years old, he met Samuel Johnson. Johnson at the time was about 54. And he really admired Johnson. Johnson had written the dictionary by that time. Johnson had written The Vanity of Human Wishes. Johnson had written Irene. This becomes a major figure. And Boswell liked to meet major figures. He met Johnson at Tom Davies' bookstore, and he was all flustered. He turned to Johnson and said, "I'm sorry to say I'm from Scotland," as though, "I'm sorry I hadn't met you earlier." Johnson, of course, who had a bias against Scotland, said, "No one should be sorry to leave Scotland." At that point, I suppose Boswell felt that he really should bring Johnson to Scotland to teach him all that he could learn about his native country. By that time, Boswell was a young lawyer, and he was practicing law in Glasgow and coming down to London for major court appeals. But in 1768, he published an account of Corsica. Now, Corsica at the time was seeking its independence from Portugal, and the leading insurgent in Corsica was a man by the name of Paoli, Paoli. Boswell lived among these insurgents. He dressed in their costume. He even brought their costume back to London. And he celebrated the revolutionary efforts of Paoli and others to free themselves from Portuguese Angola. Now, it was a sensation. He sold 10,000 copies. That's a bestseller in this period. He became the man who traveled, the man who was engaged in adventure, the man who met these revolutionaries. And of course, this is the beginning of the revolutionary spirit. You have the movement out of Corsica, then you move into the American Revolution, the French Revolution, eventually you're moving into the Russian Revolution. We're moving into a revolutionary period. Boswell then persuaded Samuel Johnson to go with him to Scotland. And out of that, in 1785, came the Journal to the Hebrides, where he discusses his voyage and Samuel Johnson's voyage, trip to Scotland. Johnson also published a work on his trip to Scotland called The Journey to the Western Islands. And it's worthwhile to match these texts to see how the voyage differs and what the different emphases is. Johnson died in 1784, and Boswell's life dream was to turn out a biography of Samuel Johnson. He had only met Johnson in 1763, so he only knew Johnson for about 21 years before Johnson's death. But in order to write this compendious life, he wrote to all of Johnson's friends, all of Johnson's companions, all of Johnson's acquaintances whom Johnson had ever written to, and asked for their letters, and he interviewed them so that he had a first-hand account of Johnson from the earliest days until his death. And the life of Johnson becomes a monumental work of its own. So during his lifetime, Boswell was known for the account of Corsica, the Journal to the Hebrides, and finally the life of Samuel Johnson, which was a very impressive work. And we're going to look at the life of Samuel Johnson. But no one knew at that time how much Boswell had really written. Boswell, during his lifetime, was a womanizer. He was also turned out to be an alcoholic. And friends of his, actually, when he was finishing the life of Johnson, would come to his apartment in order to sober him up so that he would finish the text. When he died, apparently his papers were burned, the papers not published, or else they were destroyed. We're not sure what happened. But his executors seemed to dispose of them. And I'm going to tell you about this remarkable story about how his papers were found. Because they were recovered, and there's a book out called The Private Papers of James Boswell from Malahide Castle, in the collection of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Hayward Isham, published in 1937 in 18 volumes. Earlier, Chauncey Tinker from Yale University had published 2 volumes of Boswell's letters. But enough documents were found, and we're going to show you how they were found, to produce Boswell's London Journal from 1762 to 63. A book that dealt with Boswell in Holland from 1763 to 1774. Enough materials to discuss Boswell's views of Sir Joshua Reynolds and others in London called Portraits. A book describing Johnson on the Grand Tour to Germany and Switzerland, which describes his experiences and his meetings with Voltaire and Rousseau. After World War II, when work became more productive and the Yale papers were opened, we have a number of volumes of Boswell's papers published under these titles. Boswell in Search of a Life, Boswell in Search of a Wife, Boswell for the Defense, Boswell the Ominous Years, and the Hypochondriac. Then we have 70 contributions of Boswell to the London Magazine. We also have republished a Journal of a Tour to Corsica and the Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides. Now, this is a remarkable output. That is, we only know 3 volumes he published during his lifetime, actually, but after his lifetime, after his death, we find that he himself is a major writer in his own right in the 18th century. And we're going to look at this in a few moments. Now, when you study the life of Johnson, you think he spent a lot of time with Johnson. Donald Green, in a book called "'Tis a Pretty Book, Mr. Boswell," but actually outlines the number of days that Boswell spent with Johnson. Now remember, Boswell is a lawyer with a family living in Scotland, and he comes to England infrequently, in some cases just to plead his case. We'll look at that in a moment. But in 1763, when he met Johnson, he only saw Johnson 20 days that year. He didn't see him again for 3 years until 1766, when he saw him for only 2 days in February. In 1768, 5 days. In 1769, he met him for 9 days. In 1772, 14 days. And then in 1773, when they went to Scotland, they were together for 116 days. The reason I'm showing you this, and the reason Donald Green makes it so relatively important, is the understanding that here is a biographer who seems to have been involved in every intimate detail of Johnson's life. And as you read the life of Johnson, you become somewhat interested in what he has to say and how he says it. But if you've been in London with Johnson only 18 days, only 14 days, and then in the year of Johnson's death he was there for 26 days, but he was not there when Johnson died, the capability of recall and the capability of regeneration of ideas gives you a very, very special figure. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about some of the events that James Boswell wrote about when he wrote the life of Johnson. First of all, let me start with Corsica. He spent more than a week with General Paoli in Corsica. He even applied for a Corsican passport. And he was impressed with himself for having gained access to Paoli. When he describes his European trip, when he describes his trip to Corsica and to Switzerland, he spent less than 10 days on Christmas Eve, 1764, at Ferney, Voltaire's chateau, a few moments from Geneva, and there he met Voltaire. He had already met Rousseau, and we have some very interesting experiences of his conversations with Rousseau. But he had to leave Rousseau's Geneva at 5 o'clock every evening when the gates closed. If you weren't a citizen, you weren't able to stay. He wanted Voltaire to discuss important issues. And when he met Voltaire at one point, he even saw Voltaire playing chess. And he got him to discuss ideas in English. Voltaire raged in his discussion on religion. He seemed to be an iconoclast. He seemed to be almost an atheist. And became so angry that he collapsed in his seat. Boswell recognized that he was faking. He chided him at that, and Voltaire finally did admit that he loved God and was resigned to his will. Boswell questioned the meaning of soul in Voltaire's philosophical dictionary. He tried to make his host come out with a firm affirmation for immortality, but Voltaire wasn't about to do that. Voltaire declared himself a monotheist. And if Boswell insisted on it, he said he would worship at least 4 times a year. A few days after being with Voltaire, he found out that Rousseau had left his wife and sent away all his children. And Boswell, who had met Rousseau and who had engaged in a long conversation with him, was shocked. He never quite recovered from Rousseau's indifference to his family and his callous behavior toward his children. These are some of the pieces of information we get from the voyages to Switzerland, from his meeting with Paoli in Corsica. When Paoli came to England, Boswell actually met him and was one of his hosts. I'm not going to discuss the journey to the journey to Scotland at this point, but I'm going to discuss some of the points that Boswell gives us in the life of Johnson. He dedicates the book to Sir Joshua Reynolds. Sir Joshua Reynolds was the Dean of the Royal Academy of Royal Arts, of Arts and Sciences, and was the great painter of the period. He describes the years from 1709 to 1728. Samuel Johnson's father was Michael Johnson, a bookseller. His mother was Sarah Ford, and he had one brother who died at the age of 25, Nathaniel. Early in his childhood, Boswell tells us, Johnson had a prodigious memory, but a terrible temper. And at one point, he suffered scrofula and his face became disfigured. And he also suffers from nearsightedness. So you have this rather large fellow, 5'11", who is somewhat disfigured in the face, nearsighted, with a remarkable reputation. From 1728 to 1731, Johnson was at Oxford. He was poor. His family couldn't afford for him to go to Oxford. He was a charity student, and he only stayed there for about a year or a year and a half. He suffered hypochondria, Boswell tells us, and melancholy. He was religious, but he never really practiced formally. We learn from 1731 to 36 that Johnson returned from Oxford, been in the area less than 3 years, in school for less than a year and a half to 2 years. And he returned to the death of his father. At that point, then Johnson began to work with Mr. Warren, a bookseller. His father had been a bookseller as well. Johnson also attempted to be a schoolmaster, but he wasn't too successful at that. He believed in a great deal of discipline. Johnson's first prose work during this period, from 1731 to 36, was a translation of Father Lobo's Voyage to Abyssinia, which we discussed the other day. And at that point, he married a widow, Mrs. Porter. Her original name was Elizabeth Jarvis. Well, these are the details that Boswell is giving us about the life of Johnson as he's trying to describe the background and the origins of this great man, and he considers himself a great man. Johnson, he says, returned to Lichfield, his home, in 1737, and then he went back to London intending to study law, but instead he began to work for Edward Cave's Gentleman's Magazine, and he started publishing the lessons on Lilliput. So now you have a translator, a journalist, a man on his way up. Remember, Boswell has not met Johnson to this point. When Boswell did know Johnson, and he used to spend time with him, he would sit there for hours with Johnson and then go home, and before he went to bed, he would jot down copious notes about his experiences with Johnson. And these also come into the famous life. In 1744 to 48, Johnson tells us that Boswell tells us that Johnson published the life of Richard Savage. I'd mentioned to you that Savage was one of the early lives. And this started Johnson in his evaluation of human beings, of human critics and human writers. At that point, Boswell informs us in 1748 that Johnson planned to write a dictionary. He was going to dedicate the dictionary to Philip Dormer, the Earl of Chesterfield, but Chesterfield refused to see him. And at that point, Johnson began to write his sarcastic comments about what a patron really is. Someone who sponsors you when you no longer need him. From 1749 to 1750, we move into the years when Johnson publishes The Vanity of Human Wishes. Boswell reports on the reception of the play Irene, and we discover that David Garrick, the actor, who became part of Johnson's club, wanted Johnson to rewrite parts of Irene. And of course, every stage producer has the right to do that, because you want the play to work, and if scenes don't work or the actors' lines don't seem to play themselves out, then you have to rewrite. We have what we call prompt books. In Shakespeare's day and in the 18th century, these are books held by prompters where they would cross out lines that the author had written and write in new lines. And so it's very important when you're studying plays in the Renaissance or in the Restoration 18th century period to look at the prompt books to see what the lines of the writer were originally and how they had been changed, possibly by the actors, possibly by the writer himself, possibly by the director and the producers. That happens today, by the way, when people are staging productions. It's not anything new. In 1751, Boswell tells us about the death of Tetty, Johnson's wife. At that point, Johnson is beginning to form his circle of friends about him, which is where he's going to form the club. Sir Joshua Reynolds and others become members of his club. Boswell tells us about the very difficult years Johnson had trying to write the dictionary. He had no patron, even though he corresponded with Lord Chesterfield. He lacked money, he lacked support, but he gained some of his advantage by writing for the magazines, by writing for the literary magazine, for writing for the Idler, and finally in 1759 he produced Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. Boswell tells us he wrote it within a week to pay for his mother's death, but we already know that Johnson had planted the seeds for Rasselas many years earlier. When Boswell finally meets Johnson, Johnson is working on his Shakespeare edition, and that becomes an impressive edition. We could, in fact, go over the plays of Shakespeare and see what Johnson edited and what his comments were, but we don't quite have time for it at this point. In chapter 1763, we have Boswell finally meeting Johnson. And the whole procedure becomes animated. Now, Boswell had what Richard Schwartz calls the Boswellizing of Johnson. Whatever happens, Johnson is at the center. Whatever happens, Johnson is the main voice. And so you have a book oriented toward Samuel Johnson by an admirer who has no scruples about the extent to which he wishes to express his admiration. We're moving into chapter 14 of the life of Johnson, where Boswell describes Oliver Goldsmith. Oliver Goldsmith was a major playwright, novelist, and poet in the period. He wrote The Vicar of Wakefield, which was an impressive novel. He wrote The Deserted Village, which was an important poem dealing with the fencing in of large areas of farmland and grazing land in England, forcing peasants off the land and into the cities. I think today if Goldsmith were writing The Deserted Village, he would probably talk about the large Walmart stores opening up and putting out of business all the private businesses in the small strips and small towns and small villages. And these villages would be deserted. These small towns would have their stores deserted by people who are going to larger corporations. I wonder if any poet would write today the deserted town or the deserted, modern version of the deserted village. I think you could get that published, any of you who are poets who want to translate the disappearance of the small town in Texas or in many other states to the large corporations and the suburban shopping malls. And Goldsmith also wrote one of the most famous plays in the English language, He Stoops to Conquer. In Boswell's sequence, Goldsmith is somewhat fatuous. Goldsmith is somewhat foolish. He makes foolish statements, and Johnson always puts him down. We also have Dr. Adam Smith, who is described, and Boswell is concerned to some extent that some of the people have a tendency toward Jacobitism, or at least he discusses the tendency toward Jacobitism, which is a support of the Stuarts. Remember, at this time, the King of England is George III. He's not a Stuart. The Stuart is Bonnie Prince Charlie, who's living over in France. In 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie led a revolution through Scotland down into England to try to reclaim the throne. His troops moved within 30 miles of London, and then they were beaten out by George's troops. And Bonnie Prince Charlie fled back through France and then back through Scotland and then through France. Bonnie Prince Charlie lived until 1788, when there were many people, during which time many people felt that he really was the true claimant to the throne of England. So anyone who was a Jacobite was advocating bringing the Stuarts under Bonnie Prince Charlie back to England. Remember, James was thrown off the throne in 1688. So for 100 years, there were people in England who claimed the wrong ruler was on the throne, that the Stuarts had to come back. And that threat was always on England. In 1715, the Scots led a revolution which was defeated. In 1745, you had this famous revolution that was defeated. We'll see next week when we talk about Robert Burns what the effect of 45 had on the Scots, because the English were absolutely brutal. They suppressed the Scots. They took away their colors, forbade them from carrying arms. It was and forbade them from publishing in the dialect. We'll talk about that. Boswell tells us that from 1763 to 65, Johnson was very much involved in the literary club, and I pointed out to you last time who the members of this club were. At that point, Johnson meets Henry Thrale. Henry Thrale was a brewer, and his wife became very close to Johnson. They became close friends. When Henry Thrale died, his wife married an Italian by the name of Piazzi in a marriage that Johnson didn't favor, and they moved on. All right, a few more details. In 1773, Johnson published another edition of his dictionary and another reprint of his Shakespeare. And Boswell began to enter into discussions with Johnson on various issues, even issues such as suicide. In 1773, they went to Scotland, and we have the beginning of the trip to the Hebrides. One of the characteristics of the trip to the Hebrides was that Boswell was sure that his father, who was very rigid Scots, would fight or get into an argument with Boswell, with Johnson, and Boswell wanted to write up the arguments between his father and Johnson. In fact, he was disappointed to discover they got along quite handsomely. Among Johnson's discoveries in Scotland was the theory of Lord Monboddo, Monboddo, that man descended from primates. In 1776, Boswell tells the story of Johnson's meeting John Wilkes. I had mentioned this earlier. John Wilkes favored the American Revolution. He was a revolutionary. He was a liberal. Johnson was not a revolutionary, and Johnson was everything but a liberal. And Boswell was sure that if Johnson met Wilkes, there would be fireworks. Boswell kind of spurred Johnson on. He asked Johnson whether there's anyone Johnson would not dine with. And Johnson said no, he would dine with anyone who sat at the table with him. So Boswell invited Wilkes in. Wilkes was essentially the devil in politics at the time. And again, Boswell discovered that Johnson was able to get along handsomely with Wilkes. And these kinds of episodes have been written up in the scholarship and can be studied in depth. When you're reading Boswell's Life of Johnson, you're in fact recognizing some of the major events of society and some of the major figures in society. At one point, Boswell tells us about Johnson's meeting with George III. And he talks about the conversation that George III had with Boswell, with Johnson. This is where Richard Schwartz, in his Boswellizing of Johnson, says that Boswell kind of decorated the scene. What happened was Johnson was not really, according to Hester Piazzi, Mrs. Piazzi, who wrote also a biography about Johnson. Johnson was not by himself in the room with George III. George III was with a number of people, and he would visit each of these people out in a circle and compliment them briefly. And Boswell has taken that episode and turned it into a major meeting between George III and Johnson. And very well may be so, and very well may be true. Now, the life became celebrated, but when Boswell died, 4 years after the life was published, 95, his executors hid all his papers. And there are several reasons for it. Number one, Boswell wrote everything. He was absolutely candid about anything that happened to him. And we find out when the London Journal was finally published that he describes among his events and events of his life his love affairs. He went to the theater one night and fell in love with an actress by the name of Louisa, and then invited her to his apartment after the theater. And he sat there having dinner with her in his apartment. He says he was very excited to see the maid fluff up the bed behind them in the bedroom as they were eating dinner. And then, of course, he went to bed with Louisa. Several days later, or about a week later, when he discovered he had contracted venereal disease, his comment was, "To think that corruption lodges beneath so fair a frame." Several years later, he met her on the street, and he asked her why she had not told him she was corrupted. She told him she was not. She insisted she was not, and Boswell informed her that there could have been no one else but her at the time. She finally broke down and said, yes, she had had some disease, but she had been cured of it. Boswell's response was, you may be assured that you were not. Now, these kinds of episodes would have embarrassed Boswell's family, and consequently, such episodes as these were likely to have been suppressed. And so I'd like to briefly review some of the events of the discovery of Boswell's papers. Boswell died in 1795, and his papers were entrusted to his executors, Sir William Forbes, Edmund Malone, who produced his own edition of Shakespeare, and the Reverend William Johnson Temple. Now, this is kind of a detective story, and so I want to tell it to you because when you deal with literary investigation, much of what you read about Boswell was never known in his lifetime, was never read in his lifetime. It wasn't even discovered until the late 19th century and early 20th century. Here's what happened. His executors asked that all manuscripts, all compositions, all letters from various persons be returned to the Boswell estate so that Boswell's peccadilloes and Boswell's experiences wouldn't be part of this understanding. They decided that all these papers should go to Boswell's son James when he was of age to handle them. And they were housed at the archives at the Boswell ancestral home called Auchinleck, Auchinleck. Any requests to read these papers, any requests to see what Boswell had written, were refused. No one knew them. In 1829, a man by the name of John Croker wanted to see or look at Boswell's papers to come up with an edition of his Life of Johnson. He asked Sir Walter Scott to intervene, but no one would release any information, even though they had the papers of Boswell. In 1825, James Boswell's son began to sell some of his library, but there weren't very many papers there. But in 1857, a collection of intimate letters from Boswell to William Johnson Temple were found in Boulogne by a major stone of the East India Company. He bought a package, I think it was a package of, he bought some fish And the fish were wrapped up in paper that had Boswell's signature on them. He bought all the sheets remaining, and he began to discover that Boswell's papers, a number of them were in France, and they were being sold as garbage, as waste paper, and they were being used to wrap up groceries and other products. What happened was the Temple's daughter, the executive, Temple's daughter, had married a clergyman named Paulet, and they fled to France to avoid creditors. When he died, the papers that he had taken with him from the Boswell estate found themselves in the waste paper market. Amazing discovery. There was a reference that a mass of Boswell's papers were buried in Scotland. And a man by the name of Birkbeck Hill began to ask the family in Scotland where Boswell's papers were, and he was repulsed. At the death of Boswell's grandson, Sir James Boswell, the Auchinleck estate passed to two daughters, Mrs. Mounsey, who continued to live there, and another of his daughters married the heir, Lord Talbot of Malahide Castle in Ireland, near Dublin. Mrs. Mounsey died in 1905. Now, these papers had not been seen yet, but they're papers that had been collected from the garbage heap in France. In 1905, the last heir to some of these papers died, and many of these papers were sent to Malahide Castle in 1917. The story is told that soldiers in Malahide Castle, who were stationed there during World War I, were looking for scrap to burn to keep themselves warm, and they found two big caskets of papers, trunks full of paper, which had Boswell's material in them. They didn't burn them, fortunately. And in 1920, a man by the name of Chauncey Tinker from Yale, became interested in Boswell's papers, and he received an illegible note that told him to try Malahide Castle. In June of 1925, he went to Malahide Castle, and he found Boswell's ebony cabinet. Boswell had a large desk, about from floor to ceiling. It had many, many drawers in it, and every drawer was filled with Boswell's writing, including the London Journal, where he describes the episode with the actress Louisa. He asked to edit these papers, Chauncey Tinker, and he was refused. But in 1925, an American collector of 18th century rarities by the name of Ralph Isham arranged for the purchase of these manuscripts. And after his death, they were given over to Yale University. This was before World War II, of course. In 1930, in Malahide Castle, there was a box that was supposed to contain croquet equipment filled with Boswell's papers, and a cupboard that no one had looked at for years with Boswell's papers. Then people were told to go to Fettercairn House. Fettercairn House was another of the Boswell family estate in Scotland. And a Professor Abbott of Aberdeen University was told to go to Fettercairn House, where he found two of Boswell's journals and more than 1,000 letters. In 1939, in the outbuildings of Malahide Castle, more papers were found in a grain storage bin, in a loft filled with old furniture. And finally, the Mellon family in 1949 bought all these papers and transferred them to Yale University. So you are witness to a great deal of information that makes Boswell a major writer. And none of it was available to people in the 18th century because his family was embarrassed with him. He had contracted and suffered from venereal disease. He was an alcoholic at the end of his life, and they didn't want their reputation to be sullied by the works of James Boswell. Well, let's talk about some of the works of James Boswell and see where they take us. Let's look, for example, at Boswell for the Defense, covering the years from 1769 to 1774. This is not in your text. I'm just going to review some details, and then we'll move into the works in your text themselves. In these years, where we see Johnson concerned with the well-being of his wife, Margaret Montgomery, he was concerned for her. He was a little bit saddened when he had to leave Scotland to come to London to plead the case for Campbellton, a schoolmaster. I'm sorry, a man by the name of Hasty, who was a schoolmaster in Scotland, who had been accused of beating his students. He was accused of severe chastisement. And he had been dismissed from school because the parents complained, or other people complained, or the students complained. But the courts ruled in Boswell's favor. They said that it was dangerous to lessen the dignity of teachers and to make them afraid of parental resentment. Now, what's happened today? Today, you can be sued, I suppose, if a student is beaten or paddled or whipped in any way in schools as a way of punishment. We no longer can accept that. But Boswell defended his client in that case. Boswell, in order to conduct this case, sought the help of many people who gave him advice. At first, there was some warning that he wouldn't get any satisfaction in the London courts. One of his correspondents said, "You have no chance, for consider the greatest part of the schoolmasters about London are Scotch. If he beats the children of his own countrymen so terribly, what will he do with ours?" So there was a concern that Hasty would get no sympathy from Englishmen who felt that the Scotsmen were being too rigid. Boswell describes his conversation with Johnson. Boswell says to Johnson, because he was discussing the case with Johnson when he was in London, Boswell speaking, "It is a very delicate matter to interfere between a master and his scholars, nor do I see how you can fix the degree of severity that a master can use." Johnson says, "No, sir. Till you fix the degree of negligence and the obstinacy of the scholars, you cannot fix the degree of severity of the master." Severity punishment, must be continued until obstinacy is subdued and negligence is cured. It's an illness. If you don't pay attention in class, if you're obstinate, if you refuse to do your homework, it's an illness, and this has to be beaten out of you or solved in some way. Boswell, now, his job is to defend his client, but he admits to Johnson, "To speak candidly, sir, this man was rather too severe." Johnson's comment was, "Has he broken any bones?" Boswell says, "No." Johnson, "Then, sir, he is safe enough." So Johnson even more severe. And Boswell, recognizing that his client may have a weak case, Boswell was in London on 2 occasions to help Hastie, and he also accepted the cases of common criminals who were unfortunate, who were desperate, and who were clearly guilty. During the summer of '73, Boswell defended Thomas Gray. This is not the poet. Thomas Gray, who was accused of killing his best friend. Boswell said the man was intoxicated, and that didn't help. In 1774, Boswell defended John Reed in the Court of Sessions. Reed was accused of stealing 19 sheep. This was in 1774. Boswell had successfully defended Reed against the same charge in 1766, about 8 years earlier. So now Reed was on trial a second time for stealing sheep. Reed contended the sheep had been received. He had received the sheep from a man by the name of Gardner, who had since been transported to America and couldn't testify. So he had no real witness to show why he had these sheep. The prosecution wanted to point out that Reed was a perpetual criminal, and therefore he really had no defense. So Reed was sentenced to be hanged. Now, when you receive a death sentence in Scotland, you have to appeal to the English courts. Boswell tried to mitigate Reed's sentence and have him transported, but the courts weren't interested in that happening. Boswell then attempted to get a pardon from the king. He got a reprieve for 2 weeks, but still no release. Finally, Boswell was told that the court was going to hang his client. So Boswell felt that he should at least put up the best defense he could, knowing he was going to lose. And he did. He comments about how he himself was really proud of the compliments that he had received from the court for his conduct and for his defense. And consequently, he came out with a fine reputation as a lawyer, and Reed was hanged. In Boswell for the defense, we have a lot of events describing him as a lawyer and describing his relationship with his others whom he's defending, his family whom he is protecting, and for whom he is earning his living, and again his relationships with Johnson when he comes to London and talks about his life. Now, what we have is a remarkable figure here, a man who is capable of writing a biography of the major writer in England. A man who is capable in his own lifetime of gaining fame by virtue of his trip to Corsica and by virtue of his celebrating his description and his trip through Scotland. And furthermore, by his writing the life, which is still the model for biographies, because not only does Boswell give us a full sense of this man's life, he evaluates Johnson's writing and he places him in the context of leading writers of the period. Now I'd like to read a few conversations here. The conversation between Boswell and Rousseau. You don't have it in your text, but it gives you some idea about the way Boswell records the conversation, because he records what he has said and records what Rousseau has said. Boswell turns to Rousseau. And he's talking about whether Rousseau believes in religion. He says on December 5th, when I waited upon Monsieur Rousseau this morning, he said, "My dear sir, I'm sorry not to be able to talk with you as I would wish." I told him how I had turned Roman Catholic and had intended to hide myself in a convent in France. Boswell, of course, is goading on Rousseau. He said, "What madness! I too was a Catholic in my youth. I changed and then changed back again. I returned to Geneva and was readmitted to Protestantism. I went among Catholics and would say to them, 'I am no longer one of you.' And I got on with them excellently," says Rousseau. Boswell says, "I stopped him in the middle of the room and I said to him, 'But tell me sincerely, are you a Christian?' I looked at him with a searching eye," Boswell says. Look, he's playing up himself as well. He's aggrandizing himself. He's making himself an interlocutor and a judge. He's asking the right questions. He's challenging the great man, so that Boswell is the center of his work as well as Rousseau. I looked at him with a searching eye. His countenance was no less animated. Each stood steady and watched the other's looks. He struck his breast and replied, 'Yes, I piqued myself upon being one.'" And now Boswell gives us these tags. Boswell says something, Rousseau says something, Boswell, and you see this in the text. Boswell says, "Sir, the soul can be sustained by nothing save the gospel." Rousseau, "I feel that. I am weak. There may be things beyond my reach, or perhaps he who recorded them made a mistake. I say God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost." And Boswell then looks at him and says, "But tell me, do you suffer from melancholy? I mean, do you suffer from religious depression in any way?" is what he really means. Rousseau, "I was born placid. I have no natural disposition to melancholy." Boswell says, "I, for my part, suffer from it severely. And how can I be happy? I who have done so much harm." Boswell says, "I've lived a dissolute life. Can religion help me in this dissolute life?" Rousseau says, "Begin your life anew. God is good, for he is just. Do good. You will pay off all the harm you have done. say to yourself in the morning, come now, I'm going to pay off so much harm. 6 well-spent years will pay off all the years you have done harm. So this is Rousseau's advice to Boswell. Boswell doesn't believe it. Boswell says, what is your view of cloisters, penances, and remedies of that sort? Do you believe in confession? Do you believe in the special dispensation? Rousseau comes back and says, now he believes in religion, but he doesn't believe in all this artificial action. He says, mummeries, all of them, invented by men. Do not be guided by men's judgments, so you will find yourself tossed to and fro perpetually. Do not base your life on the judgments of others. First, because they are as likely to be mistaken as yourself. You ask others for advice, they're likely to be mistaken just as you are. And further, because you cannot know that they are telling you their true feelings. They may be motivated by interest or by convention or by trying to make you agree with them. And so you have these conversations between Rousseau and Boswell dealing with the nature of religion, the profound matters, where Rousseau, a free thinker, is pinned down by Boswell. And Boswell has recorded these adventures in his works. Now, his family, of course, which was quite the orthodox, would not want him in any way to disparage or attack the formal nature of religion. And we'll get into that in just a few moments. What I want to do now is look at some of the excerpts that you have in your text. I've secreted my material away for just a moment here. Your text. Turn to page 1104 in your text, where Johnson disagrees with some of Rousseau's views. Rousseau wants to return to primitive society. And Boswell says, Rousseau's treatise on the inequality of mankind was at this time a fashionable topic. I'm sorry, what page do you have in your edition? The top of the page has the word Nicholson there. It's the same pagination, same page, but different numbering in the second edition.
The words are off on the pages also.
The passage begins, Rousseau's treatise on the inequality of mankind. It's footnote 25. Rousseau's treatise on the inequality of mankind is entitled the Discours sur l'origine et le fondement de l'inégalité parmi les hommes, published in 1755, the same year that Johnson published his dictionary. Rousseau's treatise, says Boswell, gave rise to an observation by Mr. Dempster that the advantages of fortune and rank were nothing to a wise man who ought to value only merit. What is Johnson's reply? Johnson says, if man were a savage, living in the woods by himself, this might be true. But in a civilized society, we all depend on each other. And our happiness is very much owing to the good opinion of mankind. Johnson goes on to describe what a civilized world is. Now remember, we're dealing with the idea that if you isolate yourself, in 18th century literature, you are abnormal. You're mad, as Gulliver isolated himself at the end of Gulliver's Travels. You have to be considered mad if you don't want to go home to your family and live amongst your fellows. Says Johnson, now, sir, in civilized society, external advantages make us more respected. External advantages make us more respected. If you were living today, what would he say? You're more respected if you're driving a Cadillac than if you're driving a Dodge. You're more respected if you're wearing a Gucci tie than if you're wearing a tie out of Kmart. You're more respected if you're living in a large brick home rather than a wooden frame home. Single. What does Johnson mean? Now, sir, in civilized society, external advantages make us more respected. A man with a good coat upon his back meets with a better reception than he who has a bad one. Sir, you may analyze this and say, what is there in it? But that will avail you nothing, for it is part of a general system. You have to understand that people value material objects. Johnson, many years preceded Thorstein Veblen in the theory of the leisure class, who talks about conspicuous consumption. Not only are we concerned by material goods, but these material goods must change in their appearance every year. Therefore, you can tell a 2004 automobile from a 2003 automobile by a change in the fender. You can tell the difference in the kinds of clothes you're supposed to wear today as opposed to the clothes you wore 2 or 3 years ago. A professor publishes a book and changes one page and suddenly comes out with a second edition because he wants to make more money. And therefore you have conspicuous consumption. You have to have this new page even though the rest of the book may be the same. People collect trinkets. What was it, some years ago, where they were collecting these stuffed dolls? What? Beanie Babies. And people were collecting Beanie Babies and expected to make a fortune by selling them. Then they went out of fashion. And something else became more conspicuous. And people needed to consume that. So long before Thorstein Veblen's theories of conspicuous consumption in 1929, Johnson was telling us that sometimes the clothes you wear and the quality of car you drive may in fact give you greater respect than others would receive. It's part of the system. Says Johnson, pound St. Paul's Church into atoms and consider any single atom. It is, to be sure, good for nothing. But put all these atoms together and you have St. Paul's Church. Now what's the point of all that? So it is with human felicity, human happiness, human compassion, human kindness. So it is with human felicity, says Johnson, which is made up of many ingredients, each of which may be shown to be very insignificant. But in civilized society, personal merit will not serve you so much as money will. Here we have it again, Johnson saying. Now, remember, Johnson comes from abject poverty. He couldn't even go to Oxford. He had to leave Oxford early because he had no money. He had to come to London looking for money. The years he spent writing his dictionary, he was impoverished. Until he got a pension, he had no visible means of support other than publishing and getting paid bit by bit. So his valuation of money comes from having had no money. And it's kind of a bitter statement here. But what you're getting, of course, is not Johnson writing these views at all. You're getting Boswell jotting down what he knows Johnson has said. He jotted it on his cufflinks. He jotted it on his shirt. He jotted it on slips of paper. And then he went back to his apartment and he tried to put them together. In civilized society, says Johnson, personal merit will not serve you so much as money will. Sir, you make the experiment. He says, try it out. If you don't believe me, go into the street and give one man a lecture on morality and another a shilling, and see which will respect you most. If you wish only to support nature, Sir William Petty, who did an accounting and has the statistical analysis of the economy of the time, Sir William, we have a book we've issued in the Defoe series called The Essay on Projects. We have a lot of statistics in there compiled by William Petty. So William Petty fixes your allowance at £3 a year. But as times are much altered, let us call it £6. This sum will fill your belly, shelter you from the weather, and even get you a strong, lasting coat, supposing it to be made of good bull's hide. Now, sir, all beyond this is artificial. If you have £6 a year, and you can eat, and you can have shelter, and you can have a good suit of clothes, you're in good shape. Everything else, he says, is extra. Everything is artificial. Now, sir, all beyond this is artificial, and is desired in order to obtain a greater degree of respect from our fellow creatures. And, sir, if £600 a year, now that's 600 times, hundreds of times what you're talking, and sir, if £600 a year procure a man more consequence, and of course more happiness than £6 a year, the same proportion will hold as to 6,000, and so on as far as opulence can be carried. Perhaps now, what is the question? Who gains happiness out of all this money? Says Johnson. Perhaps he who has a large fortune may not be so happy as he who has a small one. But that must proceed from other causes than from his having a large fortune. So now Johnson is separating the issue of money. You say people who are rich may not be happy. Boswell says that's not a consequence of the money. That's a consequence of the relations you have and what you do and how you evaluate and how you think and what your system states is your equilibrium. We have episodes in Johnson's works. We have the episode in Boswell's works. We have the episode of Reed. We have the episode of visiting Rousseau. We have the episode of Louisa. But we have these long, protracted philosophical statements, also by Rousseau, also by Johnson, and they're recorded by a remarkable biographer, James Boswell. You can spend the rest of your days in academia and write your doctoral dissertation on James Boswell. If you have not yet decided on a research topic, any one of Boswell's multiple volumes are worth examining reading, and explicating. Next week we'll speak about another Scotsman, Robert Burns.